One of my first memories as a child was a funeral, my uncle's funeral. He was my mom's half brother and considerably younger than her, as he was from her dad's second marriage. I think he was in his mid 20s and he was addicted to ecstasy. Of course, I didn't know that at the time. Since he was addicted to the high, he started to get depressed whenever he wasn't high and ended up committing suicide. He hung himself in his bedroom. How do you explain that to a 4-year-old? I don't know if my mom told me about the hanging back then, but I knew that he had killed himself. I remember my mom telling me that he thought no one loved him, and that's why he did it. She doesn't remember telling me this, but I remember. I remember blaming myself for his death. I was always afraid of older men when I was young. I'm not sure why, I was just a really shy kid. I never wanted to play with my uncle, and I always avoided him. At 4 years old, I thought that he'd killed himself because of me. I know that's not true now, but I still feel guilty about never wanting to spend time with him. The most vivid memory I have of the funeral was playing a game with my sister and two cousins. It was called Inky Pinky Ponky. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't. But I have never heard anyone mention it since that day. I've heard similar versions of the game, but not the same as this one. In the game, one person is the leader and everyone else stands in a circle with their fists held out in the middle. The leader thumps everyone's fist around the circle, saying this rhyme: Inky Pinky Ponky, Daddy bought a donkey, donkey died, Daddy cried, Inky Pinky Ponky. Whoever's fist the leader lands on last has to put that hand behind their back, and then it repeats until only one person is left with a hand in. They're the winner. At 4 years old, I really hated the game. My uncle's death was the first death I had ever had to cope with, and singing about a dead donkey did not help me much. I always thought being afraid of death was a normal fear that everyone had, but my fear went deeper. I refused to watch any movies where characters died. I didn't watch The Lion King until I was about 16 years old. I was terrified of hospitals and still won't go in one unless I absolutely have to. I was always afraid to go to sleep when I was young, and I think it had something to do with the fact that going to sleep and dying seemed so similar. Parents often explain death as going to sleep forever. I'm not sure if that's how my parents explained it to me, but it certainly would explain it. Perhaps my fear of sleep is also stemmed from nightmares I used to have. One in particular is so silly now that I look back on it. I dreamt that I was running away from a witch in the forest. She eventually caught me, brought me back to her house, and tried to cook and eat me. Of course, I woke up before that happened. Another time, when I was older, I dreamt that I had done something bad at school and they were going to punish me with the death penalty. I begged my parents to do something about it, but they just shrugged it off. I woke up and I was sitting in the electric chair. One dream I remember the least about probably affected me the most. I dreamt of a funeral, but not just any funeral. A funeral for a baby. The only image I remember from this dream is a tiny little coffin, and that image haunted me throughout my childhood. A few years ago, I was going through old photos on a rainy afternoon. I sat on the floor of the living room, flipping through the albums, admiring how cute I was. Then, I went through a box of photos which were mostly doubles or just pictures that had never made it into the album. Towards the end of the box, I found a card with a picture of a baby on it. The baby kind of looked like me, but I knew it wasn't me because it said Peter on it. I didn't bother to open the card, I just turned it to my mom and asked her who it was. "Oh, that's the funeral card from when your Aunt Susan's baby died." "Aunt Susan had a baby?" I asked. "Sort of. The baby was a stillborn about 7 months. It was close to full term she had ever reached, so they had a funeral for the baby. You were there." My mom's casual retelling of the events flooded my mind with images. It all came back to me before I could even blink. My dreams of the baby's funeral wasn't just a dream. It had actually happened. I was just too young to remember. The baby died when I was about 3, almost 4, about 6 months before my uncle's funeral. My brain was unable to retain that memory, but the nightmare that haunted me for years after stuck with me. One day, when I was 14 years old, my mom got a phone call. She sat at the table crying on the phone, and I knew something was terribly wrong. I stood a few feet from her, tears running down my face too, even though I didn't know what happened. I've always been a sympathetic crier, especially when it comes to my mom. She held the phone in her lap when the conversation was over and told me my Aunt Diana had died. She was my mom's sister, and they hadn't spoke due to drama between them and my grandmother. But still, she was her sister. I held my mom's head in my arms as we both cried for several more minutes. Then she had to go downstairs. My grandmother lived in our basement, and my mom had to tell her. No way was I going to be a part of that. I can only imagine the pain someone feels when they find out their child has died. It wasn't entirely a shock. We knew she had a brain tumor, but that didn't make it any much more or less sad. I went to sit on the couch while my mom broke the news. Behind our couch, on a ledge, we had this clock. It was a German carousel clock, and I liked to watch as the little gold balls of the carousel spun around and around. I think, in a way, it soothed me. Watching time tick by as the carousel spun was relaxing, much like the waves of the ocean, flowing in and out. I turned around to watch the clock, but the carousel had stopped spinning. The time on the clock was 3:47. I checked the clock on the VCR, which said it was 4:22. I sat on the couch with my hands in my lap, thinking about my aunt. I thought about how my mom must have felt. I wondered if she felt guilty for not speaking to her for all that time, just like I had felt guilty for never spending time with my uncle before he died. My mom came back upstairs a few minutes later. She started to walk towards the other couch to sit down when her eyes fixed on the clock. "That's it," she said. She grabbed the clock, lifted up the glass dome, and took the batteries out. She marched to the garage and tossed them in the bin where we put dead batteries. She returned to the living room, looking exasperated. Of course she'd be upset. Her sister had just died. But why all the commotion over a clock? "Mom, what's wrong?" I asked. "That godforsaken clock," she muttered, rubbing her forehead with one hand. It's just a clock, Mom. What's the big deal?" She sat next to me on the couch, and it seemed like she was trying to compose herself before she spoke again. "I've never told you this before, but I was married once before I married your dad. His name was Patrick, and he was a few years older than me. I was so in love. He asked me to marry him when I was only 19, and I was head over heels for the guy, so I said yes. We were married about a year after that. We got the clock as a wedding present from one of his relatives. I had always thought the clock was a wedding present because we called it an anniversary clock. I don't know what its real name was, but that's what we called it. I assumed it was from my parents' wedding, and I had never bothered to ask about it. It was just a clock after all." She continued. "Anyway, one day, he got into a car accident. While he was in the hospital, they had to do some brain scans just to make sure there was no bleeding. That was when they found Patrick had a tumor. He had always suffered from headaches, but it had just become part of his life, and he never bothered to do anything about it. Turns out the tumor had probably been there since he was born, and his brain just formed around it, still allowing him to function normally. He was fine for a while. Eventually, he ended up in the hospital for good though. They couldn't operate on it because the tumor had spread out in little lines. If it had just been one solid mass, they could have tried to remove it. His last few months went by painfully slow. He was basically completely unresponsive, but I stayed by his side as long as I could. I was relieved when he took his final breath." I was in utter awestruck at my mom's story. I couldn't believe that she had kept it a secret for so long. She never made eye contact with me while she spoke. She just looked down, and I suspected that she was trying to hide her tears from me. She probably didn't want me to cry again, too. "So that night, when I came home from the hospital, the clock had stopped at 7:06. I remember the time specifically because that was Patrick's time of death, 7:06 p.m. I didn't think much of it at the time, just a weird coincidence. It took me a long time to replace the batteries because it took me a long time to get back to normal. I didn't eat for days after he died. I didn't do much of anything for a long time. And then I met your dad, several years later. It was around that time that we moved in together that I put the batteries back in the clock. It worked fine for a few years after that. The carousel kept spinning. Then one day, it stopped again. That was the day your dad's grandma died. I started to get a little suspicious at that point, but I couldn't be sure that it stopped at the exact time, so I put batteries back in it again and again. And again, it stopped. That was the day your uncle died. I asked your grandpa exactly when he had died, and he said it must have been around 3 a.m. Sure enough, that was when the clock had stopped. I didn't put batteries back in it for a few years, but then I finally decided it was silly to think that a clock could tell when people died. But it stopped again, at 3:47. Grandpa said she died not too long ago, probably about 45 minutes ago. So, that's it. I'm not putting any more batteries in it. It might still be a coincidence, but I'm not going to take that chance. I suppose the clock could very well be a regular clock, but ever since my mom took those batteries out for good, no one in my family has died. My grandmother is almost 80, same with my grandfather. My dad's parents are both 92. Recently, my dad's father had another stroke. It was his fourth in the last few years. Each time, his recovery would take longer and longer. At first, he would try to speak, but no one could understand him. Eventually, he just got frustrated and stopped trying. He would sit in his bed staring at the wall while everyone talked around him. After his last stroke, he hasn't even tried to speak again. I can tell that he's miserable. I never understood why people were forced to suffer like that. Sitting in a hospital bed and being fed through a tube is no way to live, and certainly not how I want to remember my grandfather. He was always a kind of quirky guy. He's been almost completely deaf for as long as I can remember, so we never really talked much. He scared me as a kid because he was always yelling, but he was a proud man. He owned his own business and provided for his family. It was a jewelry store, and he specialized in repairing watches. He kept that business going after his second stroke when we had to put him in a nursing home. He was about 85 at the time. He could have retired whenever he wanted to, but he loved that store and he loved what he did. I only remember one specific conversation he had with me and my sister. I remember it as it was just the three of us in the house. I even remember where we stood in the living room. He showed us a picture of his father, and he told us about what a great man he was. He would always tell me and my brothers at the time is precious, and time is a gift, and it should never be wasted. He gave me this watch when I was young and told me to always make the most of every second. I think he's still wearing that watch right now. But is he making the most of every second? Far from it. So, as I rummage through this drawer at my parents' house, I think about all the good memories I had with my grandfather, trying to forget about what he looks like right now, hooked up to all those machines, his lifeless eyes unmoving. Death still terrifies me, but I think it's better than a life like that. Ah, there they are. 2 AA batteries.